For the past 3.5 weeks, I put around 100 hours into Assassin's Creed Shadows, and safe to say I have a lot of thoughts. Now don't worry, this video won't contain any story spoilers, so you're safe in that regard. I do want to give a quick shout out to Ubisoft for giving me a review copy very early so I can make this video, but just to be clear, this is not a sponsored video, so do not get any ideas. I can say whatever the hell I want. I've spent a ton of time in this game trying to take in everything it has to offer as a full-blown Assassin's Creed RPG game, meaning hours upon hours of things to do. Of course, I've not done 100% of what this game has to offer, but I have done quite a lot to the point where I can make this video. Now just some context for those who don't know, I've not been a fan of the past few Assassin's Creed games, so I went into this game with no overblown expectations, especially with it being a Ubisoft Quebec game, who in my opinion are not the pinnacle of storytelling. But to my surprise, this game caught me off guard, and I'll explain why. But enough rambling, let's just get into my thoughts after 100 hours with Assassin's Creed Shadows. Okay, let's start with the story. Now, I'm going to keep this entire part spoiler free, as pretty much all of you watching this video have not yet played the story, but instead just want to hear what I think about it. Any comparisons I make will be strictly to the 3 Assassin's Creed RPG games, being Origins, Odyssey and Valhalla. Mostly Odyssey, given that Shadows is developed by Quebec, the same studio behind both games. Since Shadows follows the same RPG format, it makes the most sense to judge it within that context. Of course, it's quite hard to make comparisons to the older Assassin's Creed games, since most of the original writers and developers are long gone, and the franchise has clearly taken a completely different direction. Now straight off the bat, the obvious question: do I like the story of Assassin's Creed Shadows? Surprisingly, yes I actually do. For this being a Ubisoft Quebec game, who as I said in the intro are not really known for delivering top tier writing, I definitely enjoyed my time with the story, and that is saying something. When compared to the past 3 games, is it a better story than Valhalla? Absolutely. Is it better than Odyssey's story? Without a doubt. But the real question for me, is the story better than Assassin's Creed Origins, my second favorite story in the series behind Assassin's Creed 2? Well, it's pretty close. And just to be clear, that's not a bad thing. Now, I don't think the story will blow anyone's expectations away, to the point where we're talking about it in 10-20 years time. This is not a story with Rockstar or CD Projekt Red levels of writing. In fact, there was one problem I had, and that problem was that the last game I played before Shadows was about 100 hours of Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, a game that in my opinion felt like a masterpiece in writing, so the drop in storytelling quality going into Shadows was expected. But I tried not to let that affect my experience. I went into Assassin's Creed Shadows with a very clear mind. I did not dwell on the fact that the last Assassin's Creed story I truly enjoyed was 8 years ago, but safe to say AC Shadow's story is one I can confidently say I enjoyed playing. This is the kind of narrative the series has been missing for quite a while. A tale of emotion, betrayal, greed, and of course the ever-present conflict between the Assassins and Templars, something that has been missing since Syndicate over 10 years ago. But I was pretty disappointed in regards to the amount of screen time they had. It's hard to say more without spoiling, but you'll see for yourself. What I will say though is don't expect any First Civilization stuff because yeah, they're not mentioned or shown at all in the story. But in a more positive light, the pacing in Shadows is a huge improvement compared to Odyssey and Valhalla, and let's be real, most of us can admit the pacing in those 2 games were not great. Valhalla in particular was a victim of unnecessary filler, but in my opinion, Shadows trims all of that down, making each story mission feel meaningful. Every story mission you complete actually pushes the story forward, instead of just, padding out the experience for the sake of making playtime longer for no reason at all. Stepping away from the positive stuff for just 1 second, I'd say I really enjoyed about 90% of the story, but there's a small 10% that I was not a fan of. I won't say where or when it happens, but if it had been done differently, I would have rated this story even higher. It's very hard to explain without spoiling, so I'll just leave it at that. Anyway, going back to the story, what really shocked me was how well they handled Yasuke. A lot of effort went into writing his story, which I wasn't expecting, because if you don't know, Yasuke was a real historical figure, but there is very little information about him in history. Now to me, that makes him a great character for Assassin's Creed. You could make the debate on whether or not he should be a side character instead of a main protagonist, but I thought there's room to build a compelling narrative while staying grounded in history. And going into the game, I assumed Naue would be the clear focus, with Yasuke just kind of there as a side character, or more of an afterthought character. But that is definitely not the case. Yasuke plays a much bigger role than I expected, and you'll see exactly what I mean when you play it yourself. The story structure may seem a bit confusing at first because you've got the actual main story, there's Yasuke's personal story and Naue's personal story. So what I will say is just make sure, and this is very important, but make sure you do the personal quest lines for both protagonists, as well as even Junjiro's storyline too. Of course I won't spoil these, but just know these Yasuke Naue personal stories are very important to both their backstories, as well as the overarching Assassin versus Templar conflict. Which brings me to that. The Japanese Brotherhood and the Templar Order are back, and it's not the the Order versus the Hidden Ones. It's the very classic conflict we've all come to know and love. And honestly, when I roll credits, I couldn't shake the feeling that there's going to be maybe a sequel, or more likely a DLC that focuses on the assassins. That's all I'll say on that before I get too excited and start spoiling things. Now, what really surprised me though about the personal questlines for Naoe and Yasuke was the cutscene quality. Some of these flashback scenes were fully motion captured, making them feel more cinematic than I expected. The reason that this is so surprising is because, well, this is Ubisoft. They don't do well presented mocap cutscenes anymore, and they have not been doing it for a while, so this was a refreshing thing to see. I mean, take a look at Mirage, Valhalla and Odyssey, 3 Assassin's Creed games in the span of 8 years where mocap was almost non-existent. I think my biggest letdown about the story was that there was not any memory corridor death confession scenes, which felt super disappointing because this is a game where I felt it would make the most sense to have, especially with there being a select amount of main targets to hunt down. Oh, and also I do have to say that once you do finish the story, there is a quote-unquote kind of secret quest that's essentially an epilogue, and that is quite easy to miss. Now, when it comes to the characters in the story, I have to admit, some of these characters are quite memorable, and more specifically, it's the ones in your hideout. I'll go over these characters later in the video when I talk about the hideout, but I can appreciate the fact that the writers gave these characters an emotional connection, instead of what they did with Valhalla, where side characters in Ravenstorm were not engaging enough for you to care about. So yeah, if you are somebody that is not a fan of the Assassin's Creed RPG games, then I'd say at least give this story a try, because it's been 8 years since I liked an Assassin's Creed story, and this one surprised me quite a lot. And if you watch any of my videos, you'd know that I am pretty harsh on games like Valhalla, Mirage, Syndicate and even Unity. When it comes to the modern day, or rather the Animus Hub, since there's no actual modern day in this game, I'd imagine most people will not find it interesting at all. Instead of playing as a character like Desmond Miles, Layla or Basim, you're just whatever the hell this is, guided by a voice ironically named the Guide. Oh, and speaking of Basim, where the fuck is Basim? I really hope they did not just abandon his modern day storyline entirely, because that had a lot of potential. But back to the Animus Hub though, there is not much going on. From what I've seen, it feels like a setup for future Assassin's Creed games, instead of something fully fleshed out. A developer even mentioned that the Animus Hub is just an introduction, and it will evolve over time. Now hopefully that is true. That being said, there are some pretty interesting lore drops in these sections, like insights into the Spanish Brotherhood, and a figure named Alvaro Cataribera. But as for gameplay, it's basically the same loop. Collect 5 floating shards, find a portal, jump in, and you end up in a mysterious Animus loading room where you just listen to dialogue for about 5 minutes. And that's about it. It has potential, but right now it's nothing special. So yeah, I'd give the overall story a solid 8 out of 10. Now just for context on how I rate these things, games like The Witcher 3, Red Dead Redemption 2, Cyberpunk, KCD 2, God of War 2018, The Last of Us 1 and even Baldur's Gate are all stories to me that are 10 out of 10, no questions about it. So an 8 is still pretty good. In fact, I'll even drop my updated top 5 Assassin's Creed story rankings right now. Number 1 is Assassin's Creed 2, number 2 is Black Flag, number 3 is Origins, number 4 is Revelations, and number 5 is Shadows. And honestly, for a franchise with 14 mainline games, putting a Ubisoft Quebec story in my top 5? Yeah, that's pretty bizarre. It could have been even higher, but there's some things holding it back, which I'll get into later when I cover the 2 main negatives. Let us now move on to the open world and the exploration side of the game. Now instantly, I do have to say that in terms of, Assassin's Creed, this is easily the most visually appealing game in the franchise, and by quite a big margin too. The leap in visual quality from Odyssey to Shadows is absolutely massive. I'd also even say Valhalla to Shadows too. The game is set in 16th century Sengoku era Japan, and one of the first things that stood out to me was the true to scale world design, especially with castles, towns and forests. It's impressive, and a clear improvement over Odyssey, where Cassandra or Alexios, depending on who you played as, often felt small, and the scale of buildings did not feel as realistic. Assassin's Creed Shadows, however, is the complete opposite. That said, as much as Ubisoft gets deserved criticism for the content in their open worlds, one thing they consistently do well is creating visually stunning worlds, and they've been doing this for a long time. Every region in this game feels different than one another. Nothing about it feels copy-pasted. You can tell a lot of care went into designing the castles, towns, and pretty much everything that you see. For example, a region that really stood out to me was Omi. Take Azuchi Castle for example. When I first saw the concept art for this castle, it looked absolutely majestic, and you know how concept art could be, it usually exaggerates things, but in this case, the in-game version was just as stunning. Same can be said about Lake Biwa, which is a very big lake in the game. The scale of it made you feel kind of minuscule because of the almost 1-to-1 ratio. Of course, it's not a literal 1-to-1 ratio because that would be impossible, and that level of detail carries over to many other regions in the game, Kyoto City being a great example. Before release, there was talk about it being half the size of Unity's map, and that does seem like it's true. Now sure, it's not a vertically dense or parkour focused city like Paris, but it's still massive, and more importantly, it does not feel copy pasted. That was something I felt Odyssey struggled with. Many of its cities have the same ancient Greek aesthetic, making them blend together. Kyoto City on the other hand feels unique in every area. The same goes for the season system. Throughout my many hours with the game, I noticed how truly dynamic the weather is. One moment, it's bright blue and sunny, and the next is absolutely pissing down with rain and heavy winds. And speaking of rain, it's super impactful to gameplay, to the point where you are noticeably less noisy and noticeably less visible. But what really caught me off guard was the winter season. I expected the winter season to be more of a visual gimmick. A game, in my opinion, that had a very gimmick season system was Hogwarts Legacy. That game had snow, but it was mostly a visual change. The map turned white and that was about it. In Assassin's Creed Shadows though, it's completely different. When it snows in this game, it feels like you're playing in an entirely new setting. For example, take any region in this game and compare it in summer versus winter. It looks like a different game. Exploration changes in such a big way too. Snow covers the entire map, making movement feel more natural. You actually trudge through deep snow and bodies of water freeze over. For example, take this clip. I fast traveled to a sing point. I did a leap of faith like we all would, but I did not realize that the water below had frozen over. I hit the ice and died instantly. It's the little details like that which can make a game's world feel all that bit more immersive. If I had to point out some negatives that I didn't like about the open world, this might sound cliche, but I'd say it would be the amount of foliage. And yes, I know how that sounds, but hear me out. There are so many trees and dense foliage in this game that if you're playing the game on PC, you are going to need a high-end system because it seriously impacts performance. Now thankfully, I played the game on a 4080 Super, but I could still almost notice performance spikes. When they said dynamic props, they were not kidding. Almost every thin tree, bamboo stalk, fence and wooden structure is destructible. Now it's impressive, don't get me wrong, and it really showcases the engine upgrade, but it's also a slight strain on performance. Another slight letdown is the lack of a manual day-night cycle, but this one I kind of understand. In the last 3 RPG Assassin's Creed games, you could change the time of day whenever you wanted, but in Assassin's Creed Shadows that is not the option. Now to be fair, there is a good reason for this. Since gameplay actually changes depending on the time of day, such as using the cover of darkness to hide in shadows, it makes sense that you cannot just skip ahead at will. Otherwise it would completely undermine the dynamic time of day system. But enough praising the visual side of the world. How does exploration truly feel? Is it monotonous? Is it just another typical Ubisoft open world that's nice to look at but empty when it comes to meaningful content? Well, the answer is neither. In fact, the content within the open world of Assassin's Creed Shadows surprised me. Now, if you're somebody in my Discord server, I remember having a conversation about the game before the launch, and I had doubts if there would even be enough things to do in the open world. And safe to say, I was so wrong. In fact, the exploration side of the game surpasses Origins, Odyssey, and Valhalla for me in terms of things to do. There is so much to do that it can feel overwhelming, but, and this is a big but, it's not overwhelming in the usual Ubisoft way, where the map is cluttered with icons and markers. Instead, it's more organic and natural. You don't feel like the game is shoving things to do in your face constantly whenever you enter a new region or a new town. Instead, you naturally stumble upon interactions, side quests and discoveries just by, simply walking through the cities and the open world. Now let's talk about what you can actually do in the world. Starting with castles and fortresses. Now if we go back to Assassin's Creed Odyssey, the open world was filled with so many castles and fortresses, but let's be real with ourselves, they all followed a very repetitive formula. You pretty much had a checklist: kill some captains, kill some leaders, eliminate some pole marks, burn some war supplies, loot like 3 to 5 treasure chests, and just like that, another checklist ticked off. But Assassin's Creed Shadows is nothing like that. It completely moves away from that checklist style design, making clearing castles feel more rewarding and fun to do. Instead, castles and fortresses in this game actually offer meaningful handcrafted rewards that were intentionally placed there during development. And kudos to the developers, because it's very evident that they have put the effort into making these locations worthwhile. Every castle and fortress contains a legendary piece of gear, not just random loot. And to get it, you will need to take out a certain amount of samurai daisho, after which a chest near the top of the castle becomes accessible. And that's it, no tedious checklist, just a straightforward and rewarding infiltration. Now, what makes this such an improvement over Odyssey is how unique each location feels. Since I'm pretty sure all the castles are based on real world ones, the design of them are different from one another. To me, this never felt like it was a chore because I knew the reward at the end would actually be worth it, and on top of that, you also earn skill points called mastery points in this game, as well as character XP. It's a much more rewarding system compared to Odyssey, where looting chests in that game often gave you junk, or worse, copy-pasted junk. Oh, and I almost forgot to mention, aside from the legendary chest at the end, there are also supplies scattered throughout each castle, and these are not just filler loot. They're actually pretty important because they're used to build, upgrade and manage your hideout. So yeah, there's a real incentive to take on these castles and fortresses beyond just getting legendary rarity gear for either Naue or Yasuke. KOFUN tombs surprised me. When I heard about these, I thought they'd be generic tombs where you just enter and in a few seconds you loot a chest, but that's not the case. In fact, they reminded me a lot of the tomb exploration in Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. Of course, nowhere near on that same level of depth, but the inspiration felt similar. They have that same sense of mystery and adventure. Since Shadows is not as adventure focused as Indiana Jones, the tombs aren't quite as detailed, but they're still a great addition. What makes them all worthwhile is just like castles and fortresses, the rewards at the end make them worth exploring. They function very similar to the tombs in Valhalla, where you venture into dark underground areas, but Shadows improves on that formula by adding some tricky puzzles that actually make you stop and think. I mean, take this clip. I was here for about half an hour, but all I needed to do was throw an explosive barrel up onto this platform and then destroy it with a bow from a distance to break open a wall. Another pretty cool touch is that some tombs can only be completed with either Naue or Yasuke depending on the challenges inside. For example, there's a tomb where only Yasuke can proceed, simply because it requires moving heavy wooden structures, something Naue physically cannot do. On the other hand, some tombs require precise parkour moves such as, swinging using your grapple hook, something Yasuke cannot do, making them exclusive to Naue. This approach makes both protagonists feel distinct instead of, interchangeable. The rewards are pretty good too. If Castles and Forts rewarded you with armor sets, then KOFUN Tombs takes a different approach by offering legendary weapons and trinkets instead. Again, just like Castles, they are handpicked and specifically placed. I do like that design choice. It keeps exploration feeling fresh and rewarding, because it's not like you can just find weapons and armor in castles, it's one or the other. Another really cool part of exploration are the parkour routes. Now these are called something like paths of valor or paths of benevolence or paths of truth or something like that. And these are preset paths scattered throughout the world that either Naue or Yasuke can follow. Though it's most often Naue since they tend to be parkour focused. And you do all of this to reach a hidden chest at the end. What I can appreciate about these is how naturally they fit into the world. They're not shoved in your face or marked in an obvious way. Instead they just exist, waiting to be found. It makes discovering them feel organic, like you just happen to stumble upon a well-designed parkour route rather than following a scripted path. If anything, this ties back to what I mentioned earlier. Exploration in Shadows does not feel repetitive or overloaded with icons like it did in Odyssey. The way Ubisoft Quebec approached exploration in Shadows is definitely worth noting. If I didn't decide to explore on a mountain, I would never have found this parkour route. That is the level of exploration that they've gone with in this game. Now here's where things start to get a bit less impressive, although they're still worth talking about. So there are temples throughout the world of Assassin's Creed Shadows, and these are a common sight. Inside these temples you'll find a set number of lost scrolls to collect, and once you gather them all you're rewarded with a knowledge point. That said, as appealing and interesting these locations are, they do unfortunately fall into Ubisoft's usual repetitive formula. After the first few times, the process of collecting lost scrolls for a single knowledge point starts to become a bit tedious, especially since as you naturally explore, your character levels up quite a bit, making these rewards feel less significant in the long run. That being said, the concept itself is very cool. Ubisoft could have left these temples as purely aesthetic locations with nothing to do, so adding something interactive, even if it's a bit repetitive, is still a plus. Maybe they could have added some sort of narrative tied to these temples, or at least a side quest involving these lost scrolls. It would have been way better than just collecting them for no reason at all. There are also activities unique to Naue and Yasuke, which you might already know about if you follow the game's marketing before launch. For Naue, there's KIRI meditation, a mini-game where you press controller prompts as they appear on screen, representing a meditation technique for Naue. However, something about these confused me. The first 4 KIRI meditations I found throughout the world were all tied to Naue's personal story, and after completing the minigame, the KIRI meditation would then transition into a full 20 to 30 minute quest, which were incredible. Of course, I won't go into detail to avoid spoilers, but they felt so meaningful and well integrated. But after those first 4 KIRI meditations, the rest felt pretty pointless. They were just scattered across the world like lost scrolls, giving you a single knowledge point, and nothing more. The same applies to Yasuke's KATA, another minigame with button prompts. Like the lost scrolls, the first few were engaging, but after that they felt like filler. The only one that really stood out was the horse archery minigame for Yasuke. At least here there's actual gameplay involved, rather than just pressing the same 4 buttons over and over again. Plus the rewards are much better. You actually get given a new horse every time you complete one, which is far more useful than a single knowledge point. There's also SUMI E, a painting side activity, and this might be a hot take, but I actually liked it, even though it didn't seem like much on paper. There's something satisfying about discovering new wildlife in the world and then being able to paint them, which has a beautifully drawn entry to your codex. It's a very simple feature, but it's a nice touch of immersion. I was also surprised by the variety of animals in the game. I did not expect there to be so many different species, but there actually are. Of course, you cannot kill animals in this game, which is a bit of a shame. I assume it has something to do with historical accuracy in Japan's cultural stance on animals at that time, but who knows. Either way, I bet the developers were happy about that decision. That means less work for them. Speaking of cultural stances, wait, actually no, ignore that, that made no sense. I was trying to make a segue into shrines. Now shrines are scattered throughout the world where you can pray to earn, you guessed it, a mastery point. Now that I think about it whilst writing the script, Ubisoft probably could have just made these activities feel more rewarding by giving out more than just a single mastery point. That might have made me feel a bit more positive towards them. These shrines function similarly to temples, except instead of collecting multiple lost scrolls, you simply have to pray a set number of times at different shrines across the world. There are also other types of shrines where you pray to them and they give you actual buffs in game for a short period of time, such as increased crit damage, increased defense, and so on. So, I do like that concept a lot more than a single mastery point. The last thing I want to touch on when it comes to exploration is KAKUREGAS, which serve as mini safe houses scattered throughout the world. Now these are a lifesaver for fast travel. You just pay 800 mon, which is the in-game currency, to activate one, and that's it. No unnecessary steps, just quick and easy access. At these safe houses you can do a lot. Refill your rations, tools and ammo, access your gear stash, accept contracts, manage allies and add scouts. But out of everything I just mentioned, it's the contracts that stood out to me the most. They're quite underrated because they're so useful for upgrading your hideout. The rewards such as resources are exactly what you need for managing and improving the buildings in your hideout. These contracts are very similar to the ones in Odyssey, which makes sense given that this is a Ubisoft Quebec game after all. In fact, I would have been more surprised if they took a Witcher 3 approach to contracts. But then I just remembered what company this is, and expecting Witcher 3 levels of depth is just wishful thinking at this point. Now there are still other aspects of exploration that I'll cover later in the video, such as tournaments, side quests and so on, and they go more in depth with what you can discover in the world. What I just went over are the surface level things that you'll come across during basic exploration. Now diving deeper into exploration, like I said, there's a lot to do in this game, and one of my favourite parts is hunting down targets. If you remember, back in Assassin's Creed Odyssey, we had the Cult of Cosmos to track down, and while some of it was fun, it turned into a grind with no meaning. However, Shadows takes this concept much further. Instead of just one group, there are many secret organizations, cults, corrupt samurai, and other shady groups, each tied to their own questline where you systematically take down every target. This is surprisingly some of the most engaging and well-designed side content the franchise has had in a long time. Each target feels unique. There are no generic enemies hiding behind the masks. Instead, these are fully developed characters with voice lines, motives, backstories and personal reasons for their actions. But what really makes this system shine is how you actually find these targets. In past Assassin's Creed RPG games, things like this would just be marked on your map, or you'd simply open a cultist tab or Flakis tab and start hunting them down. Assassin's Creed Shadows does it a lot differently. These groups are not just handed to you, you uncover them naturally at your own pace. For example, if you enter a region like Omi, Yamashiro or Tamba, among many others, you can either observe your surroundings to identify a target yourself, which then unlocks an entire quest line, or you might even stumble into them through side quests that gradually lead you to new targets. You can also find them through the main story too, and what I love is that none of this feels like filler. These quests actually add to the world, instead of just padding out playtime. One of my favourite target quest lines has to be a group called Nobutsuna Students. I won't spoil who Nobutsuna is for story reasons, but this questline was genuinely fun, with interesting characters, locations and memorable fights. Again, this system is miles better than the cultists from Assassin's Creed Odyssey, the Falakis from Origins, and whatever Valhalla was. Honestly, I already forgot. There's also the Yokai questline where you track down various so-called yokai across Japan, and some of these targets are hilarious. One group in particular is basically a dysfunctional family where certain members absolutely despise each other, while others are so close that it turns into a full-on rivalry. There's a pretty underrated one where you track down a group that kidnaps children, as well as using butterflies. You'll just have to find out for yourself. It's a lot to unpack. But there are so many different groups of targets to hunt down that I never once felt like I was getting bored. And if that was not enough, there are even Templar targets to take down. But that's all I'll say about that. Now, it would not be an open world RPG game without side quests, and yes, Assassin's Creed Shadows has plenty of them. But what I found interesting is that at first glance, the world does not seem packed with side quests, and that is actually a good thing. You don't just open your map and see a giant mess of side quests available for you to track. Instead, they happen naturally as you explore. For example, take this scenario, where I somehow stumble upon a dead body inside a cave, but it turns out it's part of a side quest. That's the level of organic exploration this game offers. That being said, the quality of the side quests varies, which is something I definitely noticed. Some of them are fantastic. For example, without spoiling, there's one involving a close family friend of Naue, and it really reminded me of Yoriko from Ghost of Tsushima. It's set in Iga, and it's an emotional tale of finding purpose, and you even meet some pretty cool characters along the way. I got lucky because when I started this side quest, the season changed to winter, and Iga in the winter, oh my god, it's stunning. Then there are other side quests where Naue and Yasuke just reminisce over peaceful moments, and honestly, I really like those. It has humor, warmth, and a human side to these characters, something that Valhalla really lacked because, you know, the campfire scene was the only thing similar. I also really enjoy the back and forth that Yasuke and Naue have. It makes them feel more real, more relatable, and it's something I appreciate about the game. There's even a tournament side quest, which is something that returned from Odyssey, I believe, so you'll have to experience that for yourself. But let me just give you a bit of advice. I recommend using Yasuke in the tournament. Just trust me on that one, because Naue, oh boy, against some of these enemies, she gets absolutely deleted. But I do think that's the game wanting you to just not main one character. Now on the downside, there's quite a fair amount of repetitive side quests that just feel copy and pasted, especially across different regions. For example, in Yamato, there's a side quest where you have to kill 100 samurai soldiers. But let's be real with ourselves. That's not a side quest, it's just a checklist objective. And this isn't just a one-off thing. Many regions, in fact I think all the regions, have some form of quest like this, where you show up and suddenly you're tasked with hunting down 100 bandits, collecting a set number of items, or killing a specific number of enemies. These are the kinds of side quests I did not enjoy because, for one, the narrative behind them is almost non-existent, and for two, the rewards are not worth the effort. These honestly feel just like Ubisoft Quebec threw in these just to make 100% completion more of a grind. It's things like this that can really hinder parts of exploration, and there was just no need for these to be side quests. But to be fair, this is just one issue in a game that otherwise does a lot right. What really carries the side content in this game was what I said earlier about side targets. I do think a lot of people will enjoy this concept. When it comes to combat, stealth and parkour, I will be grouping them as one topic, because honestly there is not much more to add. My thoughts on these core mechanics remain unchanged from my early impressions video. Combat is great and easily the best from the RPG side of the franchise. In fact, I'd even say it's the best this series has had. But if we think about what I just said, is that saying much, given that combat has never been a strong focus in this franchise? It's always been animation based, where you attack one enemy and you can somehow kill the next 45 enemies with ease. But I can safely say that Assassin's Creed Shadows combat is finally real combat. Among the Katana, Kusarigama and Tanto for Naue, the best two choices are undoubtedly the Tanto and Kusarigama. The Tanto is so fun to use, especially with the whole shinobi side of Naue's character. She is incredibly fast with it, and her skill tree offers some impressive abilities that improve her playstyle. In fact, the most overpowered skill I'd say in this entire game is called Second Hand, which is pretty much an extra assassination in the middle of combat, meaning you could very easily one-shot an enemy if you decide to. The Kusarigama on the other hand excels at crowd control. I'd noticed that in castle fights and larger combat scenarios, enemies often attack in groups, making this weapon very effective for handling multiple opponents at once. It's actually overpowered in those situations, though it's not as effective against single targets, which makes the most sense. When it comes to Yasuke's combat, I have to be honest, it just felt boring. Not because there's a lack of variety in what he can do, but because he feels so incredibly overpowered. No matter which weapon you use, the long katana, the kanabo or the naginata, his base damage is already so high that upgrading him almost feels unnecessary. He already hits like a tank right from the start. If I were looking for a purely combat focused game, then sure, Yasuke fits right in. But since this is Assassin's Creed, a series that heavily emphasizes stealth and, well, mostly being an assassin, he just does not feel engaging enough to use. That's probably why I was not a fan of Valhalla. The protagonist being a brutal Viking didn't really sit right with me. Actually, scratch that. If I ever found myself struggling or just wanted to speedrun through a combat scenario in Shadows, that's where Yasuke becomes useful. I think the best part about his build is the Spartan kick, or as I like to call it, a Spartan kick on steroids, because it sends enemies so goddamn far, way further than it ever did in Odyssey. I mean, I guess it makes sense given his size. So yeah, that's where he's useful to me. But when I was presented with the choice to pick between Naoe and Yasuke when taking on castles or specific combat scenarios, I often always went with the stealthy approach. Of course, his sheer strength in combat does bring in drawbacks in other areas, particularly stealth, which brings me perfectly to that topic. Stealth in Assassin's Creed Shadows is really solid. Would I say it's better than the last 3 RPG Assassin's Creed games? Absolutely. I'm not going to factor in Mirage because it's not an RPG game. Mirage nails stealth, but considering Shadows is a large-scale open-world Assassin's Creed game, I'd say it's the best we've had in that category. While social stealth is completely absent, something that, let's be honest, has been fading from the series for God knows how long, it somewhat makes up for it with strong environmental mechanics and of course Naoe's fast movement. That said, I feel like social stealth works better in smaller scale games. When exploring feudal Japan's massive landscapes, there was never a moment where I thought, I know, blending into crowds would actually make sense here. The world just does not seem built for it, and neither do any of the cities. Actually, maybe Kyoto City, but even that city is quite spacious. Maybe Assassin's Creed Hex will be the game where social stealth truly makes a comeback, especially with a single city environment, who knows. But what stood out to me the most was just how goddamn fast Naoe really is. The way she crouches, goes prone, dolphin dives, climbs and grapples all flow so smoothly into social encounters, making her a natural fit for stealth gameplay. Using tools also adds on to what makes stealth quite impressive. Basic stealth things such as tossing a bell to lure enemies, blinding enemies with smoke bombs to then assassinating them, or even picking them off with kunai all feel intuitive and rewarding. It felt quite satisfying diving into cover just in time to avoid detection, which reminds me, the cover system is handled quite well in this game. That alone made stealth feel really dynamic, especially being able to pop your head around the corner from a cover. One thing I will say is that while hiding in shadows is definitely an option, I never really needed to do it. The idea is cool, very reminiscent of, Splinter Cell, but it did not feel necessary, or at least it did not to me. My biggest issue though is how easy it is to escape detection. You could genuinely sprint away for about 5 seconds and suddenly you're completely incognito, ready to go for another air assassination. It's fun, but it feels like something you can abuse way too often. I don't think I have footage of it, but I recall a boss fight where I air assassinated the boss to take a chunk of his health. I then ran around the corner, climbed the roof and went prone for about a few seconds, and then did it again 3 times, and somehow he never saw me the entire fight. It was almost like I was completely invisible. But again, that could either be a factor of Naoe's insanely fast speed, or just a very forgiving and often at times poorly put together enemy detection. Yasuke's stealth capabilities on the other hand are noticeably limited compared to Naoe, making him feel less suited for stealth focused gameplay. Now, as I mentioned regarding all the things such as diving, grappling, fast movement and so on, that is all Naoe. Yasuke is quite useless at stealth, and to be fair that's quite realistic given his damn size. The same goes for tools. Naoe of course has plenty of tools to use for stealth, whereas Yasuke is relegated to a bow, he can be prone and that's pretty much it. Now don't get me wrong, he can still attempt stealth, but it often feels impractical. His real strength lies in pure combat, which goes back to something I mentioned earlier. Playing with Yasuke in the open world felt pretty boring. And finally there's parkour, or rather there is parkour, but to be honest the parkour in this game is just not for me. Everything I said in my 4-hour playtime preview still stands, and to be honest that's disappointing because parkour was such a huge part of my experience growing up with Assassin's Creed 1 and the Ezio trilogy. But let's be real, the franchise has moved far away from that, shifting into massive open world settings where the environments are simply not designed for it, and as harsh as this sounds, there are a lot of people that struggle to realize this change. And trust me, if you are one of those people, I was also like that. I'm telling you it's healthy to move on. Take it from somebody who played this franchise from the very first day it was created, and parkour was something I adored. I actually thought Kyoto City would be a parkour playground in this game, especially since it was advertised as being half the size of Unity's map, as well as concept art making it seem like it was very much viable in a parkour sense. But in reality the buildings are spaced too far apart, barely 2 meters high, and just not built with parkour in mind. The biggest issue though for me was the lack of depth. There is no freedom of movement, but instead you are restricted to being locked into specific animations. The parkour system does not offer much beyond basic rooftop navigation, and Ubisoft adding front flips in this game does not do much at all. It's visually nice, don't get me wrong, but mechanically it's not useful at all. Features like height gaining ejects are just not in the game, making movement feel very inconsistent, even attempting basic movement like back or side ejects, which are quite rare, given that you never find 2 walls or buildings so close to each other, were very hard to pull off efficiently. In fact, the only times you'd ever back eject in this game is to descend off a wall or a surface. I'm sure there will be plenty of parkour channels analyzing parkour parkour in a much more advanced sense than me, so all I can do is point you in their direction. I recommend Ropatopoulos' video when it comes out, or maybe it's already come out at this point. When it comes to parkour with Yasuke, it's practically non-existent, and that's a huge problem. If now his whole character is built for fluidity, Yasuke is the literal complete opposite. He's painfully slow and his movement feels janky, but it's not janky in a sense where the game is buggy or a mess. I'm talking about janky where he feels too big for his own good. I'd often keep accidentally running into objects and walls, all because he's too big. He struggles with even basic traversal. Climbing simple ledges that now we can easily scale is something that he cannot do. Now this is not a bad thing per se, I'm just pointing out the stature of his character and what he's capable and not capable of. Yasuke lacks Naoe's wall running and instead kind of tiptoes over walls and thin platforms. But to be fair, I can appreciate that compared to Ubisoft Quebec's other Assassin's Creed game being Syndicate, where both Evie and Jacob felt the exact same in almost every way, whether it's combat, parkour and stealth, they definitely made him stand out, albeit for all the wrong reasons. So yeah, to me parkour in this game feels less like an Assassin's Creed game and more like your standard open world RPG with some climbing elements. And of course, as I said, the direction of this franchise has shifted away from that focus, so it's sadly to be expected. You know, I think it's time to put the word parkour on hold and just call it running and climbing until the franchise returns to urban environments and the mechanics that previous games embraced, such as height gaining ejects, vaulting, ledge catching, and freedom of movement where you are not locked into automated animations. When I think of the word parkour, I think of games like Mirror's Edge, the classic Assassin's Creed games, Ghost Runner, Dying Light and some more. What we've currently got with the RPG Assassin's Creed games is not parkour. This is more a Ghost of Tsushima level of movement where grapple hooks and flipping are what carries it. And sure, if you are somebody that doesn't really care about parkour in this franchise or what made this franchise truly great back in the day, then I doubt any of what I'm saying will bother you. The hideout in Assassin's Creed Shadows was something I originally thought would not be that impactful in terms of the story, but to be fair, I was so wrong. It's so much more than just building a nice little Japanese mini village. There's a lot going on here, and it plays an important role in the narrative, character development, and even progression as you play. Now, to avoid repeating myself, I already made a video covering all the buildings and rooms you can place in the hideout, so if you have not seen that yet, go check that one out. Everything I said in that video still applies even after playing the game extensively, but where the hideout really shines is in its progression. If you want Naoe or Yasuke to be stronger, the hideout is your best friend. This is where you upgrade your weapons, dismantle old gear, and engrave perks onto your weapons. It's also where you manage your allies, and I'll talk about that system in a bit, because it's a pretty huge gameplay feature and a really nice addition. Then there's the characters in the hideout like Junjiro, Tomiko and the rest of the League, and yes, that's actually the name of the people in the hideout, the League, and they are all great additions to the story. There are some side quests that happen in the hideout, but I won't give anything away. There is also some pretty interesting passive dialogue that can happen the more you visit the hideout, and this is something that happens between all of your allies. It's a cool concept that I think is a lot more expanded upon compared to the previous home bases in the franchise, such as Ravensthorpe and so on. Now this is where I think the characters in the game really shine. Just to clarify, the League is the name of your group in the hideout. When you first arrive, it's just you, completely alone except for Tomiko. But as you progress, you can discover and recruit allies to bring back to your hideout. And what really surprised me though is there are actually multiple ways to do this. For example, some allies are introduced to the main story before you even realize that they can be recruited. Take Genojo for instance. He's one of the allies you can find and bring back to the hideout. You first meet him during a main story mission, but after that initial encounter, nothing really happens with him for the rest of the mission. Then once the main story progresses, a side quest unlocks where you can meet him again. And this isn't just some simple recruitment task, it's a full-on storyline that explores his character, his motives and a range of emotions. There's also an ally you can find during these side targets that I went over earlier, which is nuts. And that leads me on to romance. During certain quests you'll get optional romance dialogue choices, and depending on what you say throughout the quest, it can end in a few different ways. Just going back to Genojo though, in his quest you can recruit him to your hideout, you can romance him, which by the way is very in your face. Now he does not waste time, let me tell you. Or you can just reject him entirely, meaning you'll never see him again. But what really shocked me though was how impactful the dialogue choices are. No exaggeration, but if you say the wrong thing or don't respond at all, Genojo can literally die, and that's it for his character. I accidentally got him killed during my playthrough, and when I realized it, I could not handle it, so I immediately reloaded my save and made sure to say the right things instead. There are plenty of other allies in the game too, and just like like Genojo, they all have their own quest lines. You can even romance a character who I won't name, but let's just say she's a very important person to somebody in the main story. If you want, you can even have Nawe in a lesbian romance with a female character, and that female character's quest line, like the others, is pretty solid. In fact, I would not say there's a weak storyline among all the allies. Some are great, some are decent, but none are outright bad. Yasuke can also romance too, and he can also romance the same gender if you choose to, but that's entirely up to you. Remember, you're the person pressing the buttons. But moving on from romance and ally recruiting, I want to talk about how allies actually work in combat. You've probably heard by now that this game lets you assign allies to your D-pad and then call on them during fights, which is a completely new addition to the series. I think it's done really well in this game since each ally has their own unique abilities, and none of them feel the same. My favorite to use in combat was probably Genojo, since he can silently take out enemies from a distance, which is great for stealth. You can also upgrade your allies to unlock new abilities, and as they level up, their outfit changes too, which is a nice touch. So yeah, the ally system and the romance options in the game were actually a pleasant surprise. And just to clarify, romance is not canon, as confirmed by the developers. I wanted to take a moment to talk about the outfits in this game, because the designs for both Nawe and Yasuke in Assassin's Creed Shadows are pretty well done. And just to be clear, I'm only talking about their appearance here, not the in-game stats or the bonuses. Nawe has some great looking outfits, and like I mentioned earlier, you can unlock legendary gear sets, which are headpieces and body armor, by raiding castles and fortresses scattered throughout the world. And when I say scattered throughout the world, I don't mean randomly scattered. These locations are carefully placed. There are also vendors in different regions selling gear, and surprisingly, some of the best looking outfits are not even legendary, they're epic rarity. What really stood out to me though was Nawe's assassin attire. She has 3 different assassin outfits: Initiate, Apprentice and the Master Assassin outfit, which you unlock much later in the story. And honestly, the transmog system that they've added is a huge plus. It's especially useful for Yasuke because if I have an outfit that looks amazing but doesn't have the best stats, I can just change the appearance of my high stat gear to match the one I like visually. And for Yasuke, this is perfect because I'm not a huge fan of his bulky samurai armor. The outfits where he's actually wearing clothes instead of heavy armor, those are the ones where he really stands out. So yeah, I just wanted to touch on the outfits because it's something definitely worth mentioning. Okay, now let's talk about the game's performance and soundtrack. Now performance wise, I'll be talking about it on PC, since that's where I played it. My PC is pretty beefy, as it's a PC with a 4080 Super GPU, as well as a 7800X3D CPU. And even with that setup, the game is pretty demanding. By default, it launches with ray tracing on, and you cannot even turn it off, which I think is kind of weird, considering how graphically intense this game is. With everything maxed out and DLSS enabled on quality mode, I was averaging around 60 to 70 FPS, and to be honest, that's not great. I think the main reason why it's so demanding comes down to a few things: the dynamic weather system, the sheer amount of trees and foliage, and most importantly, the destructible environment. All of that adds up, and the fact that a 4080 Super is struggling to go beyond 70 FPS is a little concerning. So for people with lower spec PCs like, a 2080, a 3070 or a 3060 or something in that range, I imagine hitting 60 FPS without dropping settings is going to be a real challenge. Hopefully the PS5 version is well optimized. From what I've seen, it looks like it can hold a stable 60 FPS, but right now I can't say for sure. That said, it's kind of expected. The game simply looks beautiful, a clear step up from any previous Assassin's Creed game to date. But yeah, the performance side of things, definitely something to keep in mind. Now let's talk about the soundtrack. Assassin's Creed has never missed when it comes to soundtracks, and I will stand by that till the day I die. 17 plus years of games, and I cannot think of a single game with a bad soundtrack. Assassin's Creed Shadows is no exception. It absolutely nails it, the themes are spot on, and certain moments in the story hit even harder because of the music. The combat tracks are incredible, and even in the prologue, there's this one scene near the end of the prologue where a specific track kicks in. Without that music, I genuinely don't think the moment would have had the same impact. Every time the Templars showed up, the soundtrack matched their presence perfectly. Same with the main target members. Whenever they appeared, the music set the exact right tone. The Flight and Teke Teke absolutely killed it here, so props to them. Now, about that so-called controversy, some people are claiming there's hip-hop playing over Yasuke's combat, but that's just not true. The exact same track plays when Nawe is also fighting, and it fits perfectly. It's not a Yasuke-specific thing, it's unique and it stands out. And people pushing the hip-hop angle are just showing their true colors. Judge the game's soundtrack on the actual soundtrack, and not one singular piece of combat theme. Does Assassin's Creed Shadows have replay value? That's the big question. And honestly, the answer is yes, without a doubt. When I made my video ranking Assassin's Creed games by replay value, I put Odyssey at number 1, and that was a Ubisoft Quebec game. But I do think Shadows is going to take that spot easily. And the main reason, well, it's because of the two playable protagonists. The fact that you can play through 90% of the story as just one character is kind of crazy. That's almost what I did. My playthrough was around 75% Nawe and 25% Yasuke. But when I replay the game at some point, I'm definitely going to focus more on Yasuke, especially for missions and combat encounters. What makes it even better is how different it feels depending on who you're playing as. NPCs and characters actually acknowledge your protagonist in unique ways. When I played as Nawe, I was constantly being called a shinobi, and her backstory was brought up in dialogue. Yasuke was even referenced to in certain situations. I can only imagine how different that changes when you play as Yasuke. His history, his perspective, everything. Even side quests have different interactions and conversations depending on who you choose. The same goes for the side targets as well, because you'll get to hear and understand what the other protagonist is thinking in that same situation. So yeah, I'd say replay value for this game is quite high. I don't think we're going to see another Assassin's Creed game with this much variety anytime soon. Now, before I end the video, there are two things I need to address when it comes to this game, and to me these two things are very important. I save these two for a separate segment in this video because these are major flaws. If I blindly praise the game without addressing some of the flaws, I would not be credible at all, especially as somebody that covers Assassin's Creed. The first and most glaring issue to me is the facial expressions. I briefly touched on this in my 4-hour impressions video, and my opinion has not changed. The reason I'm so persistent about this is because if this was not a AAA game, or if this game did not cost like over 200 million to develop, it wouldn't be as big of a deal. But for a game of this scale, the facial expressions, especially on Nawe and Yasuke specifically, who are the two main characters you are constantly looking at, are just not good at all. Now don't get me wrong, there are some in-game cutscenes that look pretty good, but I'd say for the most part, a lot of them were just not up to standard. What makes this even worse is the inconsistency between mocap cutscenes and regular in-game ones. When you compare the two, it's like looking at completely different characters. The difference is that noticeable, and for a game of this budget it really shouldn't be. A great example of how mocap cutscenes should have been done is Kingdom Come Deliverance 2. That game had a much smaller budget, in fact considerably smaller, yet mocap was used so often, and it looked fantastic. Henry in-game and mocapped Henry looked the same, and that is what does not make sense to me. If a game with a fraction of Kingdom Come Deliverance 2's budget can pull off high quality facial animations, then where exactly did all the development costs for Shadows go? I can only assume a big chunk of it went into the engine upgrade, pushing for more realistic graphics or destructible environments. But still, for a game of this scale, the disparity in animation quality between mocap cutscenes and the in-game cutscenes is hard to ignore. And that's a real problem because, you know, when we think of past characters like Bayek, Ezio, Edward and even Arno, you feel emotionally connected to them. And that is why you remember these characters many years later. And for me, the reason is simple. You could actually see the facial expressions and experience properly mocap cutscenes that made the story feel cinematic and you could connect with them. In Assassin's Creed Shadows, however, a lot of the cutscenes are just static back and forth dialogue with minimal camera movement and no expressions at all in their faces, and to me that really kills the emotional weight. It feels outdated, and honestly that shouldn't be the standard for a modern Assassin's Creed game. Hell, this is a topic for another video, but you know, if you look at games like Far Cry 3, 4 and 5, Watch Dogs 1 and 2 and every Assassin's Creed game before 2018, the drop in cutscene quality is astronomical. It honestly makes you wonder if this is even the same Ubisoft, and as somebody that grew up on Ubisoft games in my childhood, it's very sad to see. But enough about the facial expressions. The second main negative I had, and it's kind of similar, but it's the voice acting direction for Nawe in particular. Now remember, I said direction, not the actual voice acting, but more specifically with the English VA. Now I have no issues with the actual voice actor, I'm sure she's a lovely person, but something about Nawe's delivery throughout the entire game just felt so off. And surprisingly, it was not like this for Yasuke. It's almost like Ubisoft had her record her lines in an empty room with nobody to interact with. Whenever she was in a conversation with an NPC, it doesn't feel like a real exchange. It sounds like she's just reading off a script. And yes, obviously voice acting is reading from a script. But the problem is that it sounds like she's doing exactly that, without the natural emotion or the right context in her delivery. It makes her dialogue feel flat, like she was not given proper direction on how to respond in each scene. I mean, take a listen to this conversation with an NPC. Ironically, the NPC sounds a lot more convincing than Nawe.
I don't believe we have met. Is there something you need?
It is just nice to see a new face. My office is empty and the ports no longer hum with traffic like they used to.
What seems to be the trouble?
Our fishermen are afraid to fish and our merchants are robbed as soon as they set sail. The people are too afraid to trade.
Who's doing this? I will help your people defend themselves.
I would be forever in your debt.
Is that just me, or was there literally no conviction in Naoe's voice compared to the NPC? And it goes back to what I said about how it felt like they recorded Naoe's lines in a completely different room. And you know, maybe they did. After spending a lot of time with Assassin's Creed Shadows, I can confidently say that this game surprised me. I went in with a clear mind and no expectations, especially considering Ubisoft Quebec's history with storytelling, but Shadows managed to exceed those expectations in quite a few ways. The story was far better than I anticipated, way stronger than Odyssey and Valhalla, though it doesn't quite reach the heights of Origins for me. In fact, I'd say it's pretty close, but I felt more connected to Bayek's story. Both Naoe and Yasuke were handled much better than I expected. Yasuke in particular was not just some background character. His story was given real weight, and that was a pleasant surprise. However, I still stand by the fact that the lack of memory corridor death scenes was a huge missed opportunity. That, alongside the weak facial expressions and inconsistent cutscene quality, held the story back from being even better. The world is without a doubt the best looking in the series. Shadows is visually a massive step up from the previous Assassin's Creed games, and the season system is one of the best features in the game. It's not just a gimmick, the world actually changes in meaningful ways depending on the time of year, which adds a level of immersion I was not expecting. Exploration wise, it's better than Odyssey and Valhalla because it doesn't feel like an open world checklist. Castles, fortresses, KOFUN tombs and even side targets all have meaningful rewards, making them worth the time investment. Combat is easily the best we've had in an Assassin's Creed RPG, though Yasuke at times feels a little too overpowered. Naoe's stealth gameplay, however, is a highlight. Her speed, her tools and her movement make her one of the best stealth focused protagonists in the series. But when it comes to parkour, yeah, it's not good. No matter how much Ubisoft hypes up flips and grappling hooks, the parkour in Shadows is far too automated. I don't think we'll ever get proper parkour again until the series moves back to a dense urban environment. So overall, I think that this is a very solid entry in the series. It's not without its flaws, some of them being pretty significant, but it's still a game that manages to do a lot right. If you've been skeptical about the RPG direction of Assassin's Creed, this might be the game that wins you over, or at the very least, earns your respect. It's not a perfect Assassin's Creed game per se, but it's a pretty good one. And with that said, that's all I got. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Will you be playing Assassin's Creed Shadows, and what are your expectations? If you did enjoy this video, be sure to hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next one.